Hello, everybody. Welcome to our American Heritage Lecture. This one on Abraham Lincoln, and I am recording this on Sunday, March 29th. I know I'm violating the Lord's Day, but hopefully, given everything that's going on, and I want to make sure that you guys have the class for tomorrow. God will forgive me for this, so it's to be ready for your March 30th class for both the 10 o'clock and the 11 o'clock sections. So I hope you guys are all doing well, and as always, I miss you. It's just lonely here without you guys, and I wish I were looking out into the classroom and seeing all of you. But I do hope you're all doing very well, staying healthy, enjoying time with your family, and keeping up with your readings. Yes, especially since, don't forget, you guys have your midterm on Friday. And I think we've got that, unless somebody has not had a chance to email me yet, I think we've got that all taken care of for everybody, including for Maya. I apologize. I had forgotten that Maya was out in Hawaii. So I'm not going to make her take the test at, what would it be, 4 in the morning? So anyway, but otherwise, if you have not gotten a hold of me yet, but you need to, please do so that we can get it arranged for you to take the exam. Otherwise, as I mentioned last week, I will presume that you will be taking the exam at 10 o'clock Eastern Time if you're in the 10 o'clock section, and 11 o'clock Eastern Time if you're in the 11 o'clock section. If that is a problem, again, please do not hesitate to let me know. Okay, so today's lecture is looking at Abraham Lincoln, and we've only got 2 lectures left before your midterm. So I want us to focus pretty much exclusively on the American Civil War and what's happening with the American Civil War. And I'd like to start off by reading from Abraham Lincoln from the very first of his debates, the Ottawa debate against Stephen Douglas. Now, there's an interesting history to this. Abraham Lincoln at this point in 1858 was still a Whig, and there is no reason that Stephen Douglas needed to actually have these debates, because it was a foregone conclusion that the Democrats would win the Illinois state legislature and that they would elect Stephen Douglas, or appoint Stephen Douglas as the senator to the United States Senate in 1858. So the fact that Stephen Douglas was willing to debate Abraham Lincoln, especially when he had nothing to lose, is really, or everything to lose and nothing to gain, is really interesting. And probably Douglas was hoping that there would be some clarification of the issues that were really burning at the hearts of Northern Americans at that time. In particular, the issue of popular sovereignty, which was very closely identified with Stephen Douglas, even though it originated with Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan. It was through Stephen Douglas of Illinois that we best remember the idea of popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty, despite it sounding so highfalutin, is really just another name for majority rule or democracy. It's the idea that a very simple majority, 50.1% of the people, has the right to rule all of the people, including the 49.9% of the people who were in the minority. Douglas is a radical Democrat in terms of believing that the vote can really solve all things. And in this debate with Abraham Lincoln, Douglas had put forth the proposition through the Kansas-Nebraska Act and had had it passed into law, barely, but had had it passed into law, that all of those new territories coming into the Union would have, at some point, theoretically, a simple vote in which a simple majority, the 50.1% of the people, would determine whether or not there was going to be slave labor. And Lincoln, as were many Republicans, though Lincoln's not actually a Republican yet, he's allied with the Republicans. He will not join the Republican Party until he is already in the White House as president, which is fascinating in and of itself. But that's another story. When we look at Abraham Lincoln and we look at Lincoln Douglas, they really represent the two positions in the North at that time of the 1850s leading up to the Civil War. One position said that a simple majority within a territory had the right to determine whether or not to enslave or not. The other said that Congress had the right, because it is in charge of all the territories and it is preparing the territories for statehood, that it had the right to prevent slavery from extending into the territories. So the Republicans and those allied with the Republicans never ally and never argued that they had the right to abolish slavery where it existed. They only argued they had the right, if not the duty, to prevent its extension into the Western territories. And that, as all of you should know by this time in our class, that should immediately call up the Northwest Ordinance, and specifically Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance, July 13th, 1787, in which Congress unanimously voted that there would be no slavery in the territory north and west of the Ohio River, meaning those states such as Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, and that tiny little bit of Minnesota, that in those states there would be no slavery. The response of someone like Stephen Douglas was to say, yes, that's true for those states, but since Congress did not explicitly ban slavery in the southern territories, this was never meant to be a philosophical statement against slavery, merely a statement against slavery legally in those areas around the Great Lakes, not in the southern part of the United States. People like Ransom Dunn at our college, very important figure, and people like Abraham Lincoln and their allies said, absolutely not. The Northwest Ordinance is more or less the thesis statement of the founding, especially when taken into conjunction with the Declaration of Independence and the idea of all men being created equal and equally endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That if you take these two things together, the Declaration and the Northwest Ordinance, you put them together, there is a natural right argument against slavery itself, but especially constitutionally against the extension of slavery into the West. So Douglas tries to push Lincoln on this and claims that Lincoln is really a radical abolitionist. That is, during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and there were 7 of them, of 1858, Douglas says, the only reason Lincoln believes this is because he's a radical abolitionist, and he believes very strongly in complete equality between the races. And we have to put ourselves in a very non-politically correct time, an extremely racist, racialist time, a time of racism and racialism. And what do we find? That one of the most feared symbols among whites was the symbol or the image of a black man kissing a white woman. That was considered a horrible attack on white culture. But even worse than that would be the marriage then of a black man to a white woman. Now clearly in 2020 we think those racial stereotypes are absurd, but in 1858 they carried great weight. Even among those people who were anti-slavery, they were very worried that if they freed all the slaves, that in fact there would be this kind of radical equality. And Lincoln is very direct in his answer about this. And this is what he says. So this is from the very first debate, the Lincoln-Douglas debates in Illinois in 1858. Here's Lincoln. Now, gentlemen, I don't want to read at any greater length, but this is the true complexion of all I have ever said in regard to the institution of slavery and the black race. This is the whole of it. And anything that argues me into his idea of perfect social and political equality with the Negro is but a specious and fantastic arrangement of words, by which a man can prove a horse chestnut to be a chestnut-colored horse. I will say here, while upon this subject, that I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. And we have to take Lincoln at face value here. So, number one, he is not arguing in favor of full equality between the races. He is also against the extension of slavery into the territories, but he does not believe that he has the ability to prevent slavery from continuing where it already exists. So in places like Georgia, or in North Carolina, or South Carolina, or in Virginia, these places that have always had slaves, he doesn't believe that he has the right to abolish slavery, whether he would like to or not, in those places. as he continues here, I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and the black races. There is a physical difference between the two, which in my judgment will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. And inasmuch as it becomes a necessity that there must be a difference, I, as well as Judge Stephen Douglas, Senator Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong having the superior position. I have never said anything to the contrary, but I hold that, notwithstanding all this, there is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence: the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, so that's fascinating, and we need to think about this for a moment. Lincoln says, I do not believe in equality purely among the races, but when it comes to the Declaration and the natural right as guaranteed in the Declaration, then there is full equality. So what does Lincoln mean by this idea of natural right? If we wouldn't have, say, from Lincoln's standpoint, a moral or a physical equality, but we would have a different kind of equality, what would that equality be? Well, I hold that he, the black man, is as entitled to these as the white man. I agree with Judge Douglas that he is not my equal in many respects, certainly not in color, perhaps not in moral and intellectual endowment, but in the right to eat the bread without the leave of anybody else, which his hand earns. He is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas and the equal of every living man. Now that's a profound statement of equality. In other words, where do we have absolute equality between the white man and the black man? In labor, in the ability to mix our labor with the soil, in our ability to create, in our ability to innovate, in our ability to pursue our happiness. We are absolutely equal, all men in all times and all places. And that's Lincoln in a nutshell, trying to figure out how do we wrestle with these questions. Now, I have to make a statement here now for us to understand Lincoln more completely as we get into this lecture and Wednesday's lecture as well. Lincoln will change his attitude about this. He had always been anti-slavery, but he had, as I think is clear from that writing, had been a white supremacist too. He had very much believed in white supremacy or white superiority over blacks. That will change dramatically starting in about September of 1862, after a full year and a few months into the American Civil War. And then by the end of 1863, he will believe, well, maybe not in total equality, probably about 99% equality. And he will continue that belief throughout the American Civil War. So I would ask you for a moment to turn to page 474 in your reader, and let's look at what Lincoln says right at the beginning of his first inaugural address. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. So Lincoln, as I said, had always been anti-slavery, but he did not believe constitutionally that the Constitution would allow for the abolition of slavery where it now existed. But constitutionally, the country had a right and a duty to prevent it from extending into the West because of the teachings of the Declaration of Independence and because of the Northwest Ordinance. So we actually had a duty to prevent that slavery from extending into the West. Now remember, as we've talked about, the West is always the history and the future of the Republic. So to extend westward is to be the future. So we kind of have this interesting mix of time and space in our American understanding. But let's look at what Lincoln says as he gives us his first inaugural. So a couple of other things to remember. Lincoln doesn't believe he can abolish slavery where it exists, but believes he can prevent it. He does not like slavery. He's anti-slavery, but he is not necessarily pro-black. He is also, when he is elected as president, even though he absolutely wins the presidency in terms of the popular and the electoral vote, it is very, very close. He does not appear on a single ballot south of the Ohio River. In other words, when he is elected almost exclusively by the extreme northern region, not just of what will be the Union of the North, but of America herself. This area, as we talked about briefly last week, that area that the Puritans coming out of New England had settled as they had crossed into New York and Pennsylvania, through the Great Lakes, into Michigan and Wisconsin, those areas where the Puritans settle, those are the areas that Lincoln will be most heavily supported. But in the rest of the country, he doesn't even, that is south of the Ohio River, he doesn't even appear on the ballot. So the 1860 election is really two very different elections. It is an election in the North for the president, and it is an election in the South for a president. And it's almost a no-win situation. So there is Lincoln, and he barely got the nomination within the Republican Party, and there was great opposition to him within the Republican Party. He is not technically a Republican when the Republican Party elects him in 1860. So he is coming into the White House with all kinds of disadvantages. Number one, he doesn't enter the White House, as you can see here on page 474, until March 4th of 1861. Well, South Carolina had seceded at 1:15 in the afternoon on December 20th of 1860. That means we have gone over 3 full months since secession began, and it means the Confederacy has existed since about February 9th. So the Confederacy actually has a month start on Lincoln as president. During that entire time, from South Carolina's secession on December 20th of 1860 up until March 4th of 1861, James Buchanan, who was one of the most duplicitous and worst presidents in the history of the United States, was occupying the White House. So Lincoln comes in. He has hardly any support from the party that elected him, to which he does not yet belong. He is still a Whig. So he has all kinds of opposition within his own party. There's no support for him in the southern part of the United States. And a crazy president, James Buchanan, has been in charge of the White House and the military for the 3 months leading up to Abraham Lincoln taking his place as president on March 4th. So, what does he say? In compliance with a custom as old as the government itself, I appear before you to address you briefly and to take in your presence the oath prescribed by the Constitution of the United States to be taken by the President before he enters on the execution of this office. I do not consider it necessary at present for me to discuss these matters of administration about which there is no special anxiety or excitement. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and their personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published sources of him who now addresses you. Right? Look at everything President Lincoln, have said up to this point, and I have never once advocated the use of force to drive slavery away from where it now exists. I do quote from one of those speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Right? Lincoln means that. Those who nominated and elected me did so with full knowledge that I had made this and many similar declarations that had never recanted them. And more than this, they placed in the platform for my acceptance and as to a law to themselves and to me, the clear and emphatic resolution which I now read. Resolved, that the maintenance inviolate of the rights of the states, and especially the right of each state to order and control its own domestic institutions according to its own judgment exclusively, is essential to that balance of power on which the perfection and endurance of our political fabric depend. And we denounce the lawless invasion by armed force of the soil of any state or territory, no matter what pretext, as among the gravest of crimes. Now, he means here implicitly John Brown and John Brown's raid in 1859 on Harper's Ferry in Virginia, which was a slave insurrection, a very failed slave insurrection, but a slave insurrection. Lincoln says, I support this. And one of the things that we don't have explicitly here, but it must be understood, is that what Lincoln read from here, this resolution, is not just a resolution. It was being proposed as the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, a guarantee that nobody in the federal government could interfere with slavery where it now exists. Now, what a different history we would have had in America had that right there on page 474, had that become the 13th Amendment instead of the 13th Amendment that we get, which of course is the amendment that abolishes slavery in the United States. What a radically different amendment. But Lincoln is quite direct here. As he says on March 4th, I have no intention of abolishing slavery where it now exists. So let's talk about this character for a moment. Let's talk about this figure, Abraham Lincoln. Who is he as our 16th president? What does he stand for? What is it that we can know and expect of him? Abraham Lincoln, in the 1860 campaign, said in one of his campaign background books that if you wanted to understand his family, it would be a history of the short and simple annals of the poor. Lincoln comes from extreme poverty, especially on his father's side. They are hard scrabble, Old English and Old Scotch Irish. His mother, Lucy Hanks, may very well have been the illegitimate offspring of a noble Virginian family, but she was not ever accepted or shown to be a part of that family, and therefore she was raised in poverty and ends up with the husband here, with Mr. Lincoln, that is Abraham's father. And these guys, as I said, they are Old English, Old Scotch Irish. They are churched. They would be generally what we would call Reformed Baptists, meaning that they believed absolutely in predestination. They believed very strongly, they probably would have thought that Calvin wasn't Calvinistic enough, if that makes sense. And Lincoln was not a huge fan of this way of thinking, but as we'll see here, it will shape him rather dramatically. His father was extremely abusive. Lincoln, as a part of this young, really this hard life, was not even able to read until he was about age 11. Now, he is a genius, a pure intellect. We've talked about a few of these guys, John C. Calhoun, Thomas Jefferson. Lincoln ranks up there. But unlike Calhoun and Jefferson, Lincoln will not be able to start learning formally until he can start reading and writing at age 11. And he never has a good understanding of Greek and Latin. He can only read in translation. That will put him at a great disadvantage versus the presidents, the 15 presidents who had come before him. Even Andrew Jackson had more of a classical education than Abraham Lincoln does. But we know a couple of things about Lincoln. Once he started reading and writing, he never stopped. This was a man who would rather read and learn than do almost anything else in his life. He was in all kinds of ways, as I said, brilliant. He read everything that he could get his hands on. And he especially was taken with the various ideas as presented in what we would call just Americana. He had three really great heroes in the American tradition: Thomas Jefferson, and especially Jefferson's ideas on the settlement of the West. Second, Henry Clay, and especially the idea of the American system, the idea that the US government would create roads and canals and that we would have capitalism in the sense of the US government working with the institutions of capital, directing them, and the institutions of capital backing up the United States government. And the third figure, so the first figure, Thomas Jefferson, the second figure, Henry Clay, the third figure, Daniel Webster, and especially Webster's ideas of unionism. These were the kinds of things that Jefferson and Clay and Webster really influenced Lincoln on, these ideas of creating a kind of American mindset. But it was Jefferson more than anyone else who intrigued Abraham Lincoln, as he wrote, "All honor to Jefferson, to the man who in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people had the coolness, the forecast, the capacity to introduce into a mere revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times, and so embalm it there, that today and in all coming days it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression." Right? This is what Jefferson offered the world in the opening to the Declaration of Independence. So again, what do we know about Lincoln? Lincoln more or less rejected the religion of his father. We'll see that here in a little bit. He lost his mother when he was very young, but his father remarried a woman by the name of Sarah, and Lincoln absolutely loved his stepmother, and she loved him. They had a very good relationship. Lincoln grew to be about 6'4". He was huge. He suffered. Now remember, this is not a politically correct time, but he suffered for what at the time was called guerrillaism. And what that meant was that his body, parts of it, were really out of proportion to other parts of it. And he had these outrageously long arms. So Lincoln is about, and I can't show you because it wouldn't mean much to you, but I'm 6'2". Lincoln was 6'4". He's 2 inches taller than I am. And he weighed a lot less. I weigh about 200. He weighed about 170. So he's 2 inches taller than I am, much thinner. But he had these arms that when he would stand, and I realize you guys can't see me, but when he would stand, let's see if I can do this. Sorry for all of those you at home. This is probably not the most attractive thing to see. But as Lincoln would stand, so you can see my arms, I don't know if they're well proportioned or not, but they come to about the middle of my thigh. Lincoln, when he stood straight and held his arms down, his hand reached down to slightly below his knee. That's how long his arms were. They're outrageously long. In fact, one of my favorite stories about Abraham Lincoln is that he got into a duel with the Secretary of State of Illinois, who was an extremely short man. And by the challenge of the day, by the rules in Illinois of duels, it was illegal, but you still had these informal rules by which everybody formally accepted dueling. And in those duels, the person who was challenged to a duel got to choose the weapon. So if I challenged you to a duel, because I challenged, you get to choose the weapon. And Lincoln, as somewhat humorously, chose longsword. Even of all things, he chooses longsword. And so at the duel, Lincoln shows up about a half hour early, and he's standing in the street with his gorilla arm and his huge sword, and he's sitting there whacking branches off of a tree. And when his very short opponent comes to oppose him, and he can barely drag and lift his own sword, and he sees Lincoln sitting there with that gorilla arm just slashing at the branches, his opponent runs away, and that's the end of the duel. So I love that story. I just think that's a great story. Cracks me up. Definitely tickles me. And so anyway, there's Lincoln. What else do we know? Lincoln had most likely a photographic memory. He was able to learn the entire Illinois Code of Law, all the subsections, subsections, subsections. He was able to memorize the entire thing in just a few days, right before he became officially a lawyer. We also know that he suffered throughout his entire life through extreme forms of manic depression. And even in his last days, was really not just depressed because of the war, but was always obsessed with his own death and actually taking his own life at all. In fact, he had suicidal thoughts throughout his life. He once said, "I may seem to enjoy life rapturously when I was in his company, but when I am alone, when I am in company, but when I am alone, I am so often so overcome by mental depression that I never even dare carry a penknife on me for fear of committing suicide." One of his friends actually saw him go into a kind of suicidal frenzy, in fact, more than once. And his friend said, "Lincoln would just go crazy, and we had to remove all the knives and other such things from him as they wrestled him to the ground." And he was a big guy, as we just said. Didn't weigh a lot, but he was extremely muscular and extremely tall. Lincoln, in his diary in January of 1841, wrote, "I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth." That's brutal. So keep that in mind about Lincoln. The last thing I want to say about Lincoln's personal life, especially as a young man, was that he had very strange religious beliefs. If you guys remember when we talked about the Second Great Awakening, and we talked about that moment in the 1790s of atheism among the youth, especially atheism that had been inspired by Thomas Paine and by Ethan Allen and a few other writers. Lincoln fell into that category. He's not born until 1809, so he's not of that generation. But he was so offended by his father's baptism that is his Baptist faith, that he really rejected all of that. And yet he kept, interestingly enough, he kept the predestinarian element of it. In 1832, Lincoln tried to write his own book, which he called the New Salem Handbook of Infidelity. And it was an argument written in the same line as Ethan Allen and Thomas Paine, trying to show what he thought was the absurdity of Holy Scripture. One of his friends remembers this time period and argues that Lincoln talked about this almost obsessively. By the way, we have no copies of that book left. That same year that Lincoln wrote that book, 1832, as a young man, was also the same year he went into politics. So his close friends went and gathered up all the copies and destroyed them. New Salem, by the way, has nothing to do with witches. New Salem was the town in which Lincoln was living in Illinois at that point. Now I think it's a suburb of Springfield, but I'm not positive. Here's what his friends recalled. "When we were all idle and had nothing to do, Lincoln would suddenly talk about religion. He'd pick up a Bible, he'd read a passage from it, and then he'd comment on how false it was, and he would demonstrate its follies, quote unquote, on the grounds of reason. Lincoln was more enthusiastic in his infidelity than anyone I have ever met. Lincoln would go further about Christian beliefs and against them, and doctrines and principles, and he would refer to Jesus Christ as that, God, I'm quoting, that bastard, and he always denied that Jesus was the Christ of God." Lincoln, however, did develop his own kind of fatalism, his own kind of beliefs, and he described his beliefs as what were called the doctrine of necessity. It's a term I want you all to know. It could appear on the final, but the doctrine of necessity. And this is what the doctrine of necessity was based on, and it's actually based on, if you guys remember, all the way back when we talked about the Enlightenments. It's based on the English Enlightenment idea of utilitarianism, and it was developed somewhat by the great English utilitarian Jeremy Bentham. The doctrine of necessity, I'm quoting, that is, that the human mind is impelled to action or held in rest by some power over which the mind itself has no control. And I have sometimes, with one, two, three, but never publicly, this is Lincoln, tried to maintain this opinion in argument. The habit of arguing thus, however, I have left off entirely for at least 5 years, and I add here, as I have always understood, the same opinion is to be held by several of the Christian denominations, and what he means here is an extreme form of predestinarianism, as held by certain Calvinists. So, what did the doctrine of necessity mean? It meant that when it came to matters of eternity, there was absolutely no free will. Man, therefore, could never be fully responsible for his actions, good or ill. His law partner, Lincoln's law partner, a guy by the name of Herndon, and we know a lot about Lincoln because of Herndon. Herndon was an evangelical, very devout Christian. But after Lincoln's death, he tried to explain what Lincoln's religious beliefs were, and he says, for Lincoln, things were to come. They came, they irresistibly came. They were doomed to come. Men were made as they are made by superior conditions over which they had no control. And the fate settled things as if by the doom of powers. And laws, universal, absolute, eternal, ruled the universe of matter and mind with man simply as a tool, a mere cog in a wheel, a small part of this vast iron machine that strikes and cuts and grinds and mashes all things, including the man who would attempt to resist it. All right, so that's Lincoln's extremely dour view on human nature. We have no real free will, and wherever we do have free will, it is only about things here and now, but really we have very little free will at all. So, one other thing I want to say about Lincoln right now, and then we'll look at the readings that we have, is that Lincoln was also, and I can't leave aside Lincoln's personality without stating this. Just like Lincoln with the longsword going in and cutting the trees, Lincoln was extremely funny. Really, I think the only two presidents who have rivaled Lincoln in humor were Calvin Coolidge and Ronald Reagan. Lincoln was outrageously funny. He loved playing practical jokes. He loved pranks. He loved plays on words. He could hold the attention of an audience with just a couple of jokes, partly because of the way he presented himself in such a deprecating fashion, but also he was just truly charismatic and funny. So I can't leave this section without at least reading to you Lincoln's very first political speech that he gave in 1832, the same year that he wrote that Salem Handbook of Infidelity. And he says in his speech, and I will read the whole thing, "My fellow citizens, I have been solicited by many friends to become a candidate for the legislature. I have concluded to do so. I presume you all know who I am. My name is Abraham Lincoln. My politics are My politics are short and sweet like an old lady's dance. I am in favor of a national bank, a high and protective tariff, and the internal improvement system. If elected, I will be thankful. If beaten, I will do as I have always done and actually work for a living." So good. I don't even agree with any of Lincoln's politics, but I would give anything to have a politician be that self-effacing that he could simply say to us, this is what he believes. Well, Lincoln only held one national office prior to being president of the United States, and that was he was a representative from his district in Illinois to the U.S. House of Representatives between 1847, after he'd been elected in 46, to 1849. And during those 2 years, he voted 40 times against funding soldiers in the Mexican War. And that was all he was known for being a pacifist and for opposing the Mexican War. His district not surprisingly, did not return him to Congress in 1848, and he was not unhappy about that. He went back home and practiced law between 1849 and 1854, but with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, same kind of thing that made Ransom Dunn, buried right across the street, that made him so livid about the idea that you could have a popular sovereignty or a simple majority vote to determine whether or not there would be slavery. Lincoln was deeply offended by this, and in 1854 he went back into politics mostly by writing political speeches and kind of behind the scenes writing op-eds for other politicians. Lincoln became what would have been known as the gray presence behind others. That is, many of the ideas that we read of in the Republican parties between 1854 and 1860, though Lincoln is not credited, they often came from Lincoln's pen, from his letters, from his writings. And one of his earliest entries we see here is an attempt to take Aristotelian philosophy and place it upon the issue of slavery and of race. Now, none of this is going to be shocking to us because this is how we think, but we think in many ways because Lincoln got there first. This is what he writes. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may of right enslave B, why may not B snatch the same argument and even prove equally that he may enslave A? Ah, so you say that A is white and B is black. So it's color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker. But I tell you, take care. For by this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. So you don't mean color exactly. You mean that whites are intellectually superior to blacks, and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. For by this rule you are to be the slave of the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. Now that's totally, absolutely, undeniably logical. But Lincoln got there first, and too many Americans had let their prejudices get in the way of their own rationality. Lincoln gives us the argument against racism through rationality, not through passion. And then he writes later, and I love this, one of my favorite moments in American history. Again, and you can hear not just the logic, but Lincoln's wit, now wicked, but beautifully wicked. Our nation's progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. We progressives, all degenerating. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We can now practically read all men are created equal, well, except the Negroes. And when the Know-Nothings, who were a nativist white party who hated Catholics and Lutherans and Jews, when the Know-Nothings get in control, it will be all men are created equal except for the Negroes and the foreigners and the Catholics. And when it comes to this, I, Abraham Lincoln, shall prefer immigration to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. I'll move to Russia, where despotism is pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Right? And Lincoln is so right about this. You either believe all men are created equal or you don't. There's no wiggle room. All men. Not all men except for you black people, or all men except for you Jews, or all men except for you women. All men are created equal. There is no asterisk. There is nothing that can hold us back from that. Lincoln understood that. He understood it brilliantly. And so let's finish off our course today by looking at two pieces that Lincoln writes. One, we should be a little bit skeptical about because we really don't have much evidence of this except that it was written in Lincoln's notes, a little scrap of paper, page 497 in your reader. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. And in the present Civil War, right, we're about 13, 14, 15 months into the Civil War when he possibly wrote this. We think it's sometime September of 1862. It is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet, the human instrumentalities working just as they do are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I am almost ready to say that this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. Why? Because somehow we are not either fighting for or against what God wants. We haven't figured out what it is that he wants. By this mere great power on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. Yet the contest began. And having begun, he could give final victory to either side on any day. Yet the contest proceeds. Why? Because we haven't figured out what the war is about. And then we turn to the next page, and we have Lincoln's 4-minute address to the people at Gettysburg, given here on November 19th of 1863. And I am so sorry for all kinds of reasons that we're not all together right now. But I want you to understand that the reason that this speech is given on the 19th of November, 1863, to commemorate the Battle of July 1st through 3rd of 1863 at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the largest battle of the war and the largest battle ever fought on North American soil. The reason they had to wait that long is because there were so many dead bodies on the field that they waited till the first frost to kill the smell. That's how bloody that field was. And so here's Lincoln. What can he say to make up for the loss of 52,000 men on one battlefield? 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. All men. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. What do you say after that? This is a rewrite of Pericles' funeral oration. This is Lincoln at his absolute genius. And what does Lincoln say? They, the dead, made this holy ground. God bless everyone. I'll see you in 2 days.